We are live and we are ready to kick off part two. So welcome everyone to part two of the State of the Union Conference, the 14th edition of the State of the Union Conference, taking place in this beautiful town, this beautiful sunny city of Florence. My name is Maeve McMahon. I'm a journalist with Euronews, normally based in Brussels, and I'm thrilled to be with you again this afternoon. We have an action-packed Friday afternoon in store for you all. A little bit later, we'll be joined here up on stage by Josep Borrell, the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, just back from California, about to head to Singapore. He'll be telling us about everything going on right now for the European Union in troubled times when it comes to security and defence. We'll also hear from the President of the EIB, Nadia Calviño, and we'll have other panel debates. But first, to kick off, I would like to introduce our local musicians. We're delighted to have them with us, and they are called Lo Squilla delle Colline del Gonfalone di Firenze. So put your hands together for them. Thank you so much. Grazie mille. So now that our ceremony has officially kicked off, I would like to welcome now up on stage the Deputy Mayor of Florence, Alessia Bettini, to welcome us all.
Hi, Representative and Vice President Borrell, Secretary General del Panta, Director Guillot, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Palazzo Vecchio for this 2024 edition of State of the Union, which opened yesterday at the European University Institute in Badia Fiosolana. Let me, first of all, convey the greetings of the City of Florence and the Mayor Nardella to all participants. As every year, we are honored and happy to have the great opportunity to host part of these important initiatives in Palazzo Vecchio. This year, too, the State of the Union takes place in a particularly difficult international situation, characterized by the ongoing Russian aggression toward Ukraine, an independent sovereign European country, and by the crisis in the Middle East, a consequence of the tragic terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas against Israel last October 7th. Not to mention other outbreaks of crisis and tensions around the world. These geopolitical challenges emphasize the importance of having a higher level of integration and of strengthening cooperation among the 27 European Union countries, including on matters such as defense. But wars and conflicts are not the only challenges that the European Union has to face. The domestic challenges are no less momentous. Among them, the green energy transition and the Green Deal, competitiveness of the single market, generative artificial intelligence, digital transition and competitiveness, enlargement to other countries, respect of human rights, migration, sustainable economic and social development, new modalities of economic governance. The answer to these challenges amount to a true quantum leap. And from these answers will depend the well-being and the quality of life of our citizens and the role that, in order to guarantee the well-being and the quality of life, the EU will be able to play on the world stage to protect and promote its interests and its values. I'm confident that the intense discussion of these 2 days among policymakers, academics and other stakeholders from across Europe, discussions held at only 2 weeks from the next election from the European Parliament will contribute to paving the way for an ever more united, prosperous and resilient Europe, capable of dealing with the multiple challenges of our global world and fit to give to our citizens the answer that they demand. I wish you all great success in your proceedings. Buon lavoro a tutti!
Thank you so much, Deputy Mayor, and thank you for hosting us here in the stunning Palazzo Vecchio. I feel energised again with the stunning surroundings, and it's a perfect place to have this reflective discussion. And the Deputy Mayor, of course, mentioned those European elections taking place in 2 weeks, just a fortnight. And that's keeping the spokesman of the European Parliament, Jaume Duch, very busy, trotting around the continent trying to convince Europeans that they need to use their vote. And just yesterday hosting the massive EBU debate in the hemicycle in the European Parliament. And Jaume Duch has made it to Florence as well and is with us now to share a couple of words with us. So put your hands together, please, for Jaume Duch, the spokesperson for the European Parliament.
Buonasera a tutti, grazie dall'invito, grazie anche della presentazione. Thank you very much for this invitation to this very prestigious new edition.
Questa nuova edizione dello Stato dell'Unione qui a Firenze.
Of the European Parliament, and just 2 weeks before the next European elections, you will understand that yes, as she said, I try to center this welcome speech, very short welcome speech, on the importance of these next European elections for all of us. They are in some way the key milestone in the life of the European Union, and they will be decisive about how good or how bad we will manage to confront different crises or difficulties in the next 5 years. These elections are going to be very different compared with 2019. Since 2019 until now, we experienced 5 complicated years. First of all, because of Brexit, then because of the COVID pandemic, and of course now with the war in Ukraine, with this horrible, terrible Russian aggression against Ukraine. And this has changed in some way the landscape, and this has changed also and in some way enhanced the importance of the next European elections. During these last 5 years, the European Union got more visibility, but also more credibility, because it was helpful, because it was able to show to the citizens what does it mean, the added value of being not just nationals of our countries, but at the same time citizens of Europe as well. More credibility, but at the same time, this is something that we have to check when the European elections will arrive. Right now, we know that 80% of the citizens think that these elections will be more important than ever because of the international situation, because the world has become a very complicated place, something that maybe we were not able to understand or to imagine 5-10 years ago. 3/4 of the citizens now tell us in all kinds of surveys that they know that what is decided by the European institutions has an impact in their lives. And I think that this is good news. But now we need to transform this knowledge, the fact that what is decided in Brussels or in Strasbourg by the Parliament, by the Council, has an impact in their lives, in the willingness of voting, in the willingness of deciding who will be those who will also decide on their behalf in the chamber of the European Parliament. The Parliament delivered during the last 5 years, the Union delivered during the last 5 years, not only because of the crisis or as an answer to the crisis, also with, let's say, its ordinary agenda that el Vice Sindaco also mentioned: digital markets, gender equality, Green Deal, migration, artificial intelligence, consumers protection. The list would be really, really very long. But the challenges ahead of us will be even bigger. Strategic autonomy, how to protect citizens on defense, on security, secure access to energy, to basic goods, to technology, how to complete the internal market, how to enlarge the Union to the Western Balkan countries or to Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, how to reform internally the Union to be prepared for this enlargement. So yes, preparing the European Union for the next years means in some way that we will need to go back to basics, to the real sense of the European Union, which is peace, protecting peace, and protecting democracy. So yes, these elections are important, not just because you will elect the members of the parliament, not just because these members will elect the next president of the European Commission, but also because this will be the moment where citizens will offer to our leadership a mandate, hopefully a positive mandate, to protect democracy as well in a moment where democracy is being challenged everywhere and every day. 15 days before the elections, our common responsibility must be to share these messages with as many European citizens as possible, promoting participation and looking for a result which allows the Parliament and the EU to follow a constructive and useful path. So we receive a very important legacy from the oldest, from the previous generations, and now our duty right now is to protect this legacy until we can pass it on to the youngest ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jaume Duch there, the spokesperson for the European Parliament. I'm sure I'll be seeing you again on the 9th of June on election night, where journalists will be flocking, of course, to the Parliament for hours and hours of coverage as we crunch in the figures and see does turnout increase and what that new European Parliament will look like. Now, last but not least, for opening words, I would like to invite up on stage the President of the Tuscan region, that is Eugenio Giani.
Just a brief greeting and a thank you for being here in the Salone del Cinquecento in such an important event. This event and this year's edition of the State of the Union is at its highest level for his tone and the level of personalities present here. Marco del Panta, thank you for such an opportunity which comes at a moment when we are all involved and getting closer to the election of the new European Parliament. We are facing a delicate phase, the relationship between and among our countries that are part of the European Union. We are facing the Ukrainian crisis, the Ukrainian conflict, but we also receive signals from Georgia, for example, and countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, but now, thanks to their will to be part of the European Union, are facing towards us. The Ukrainian crisis is a central one. Europe stands with Ukraine. Europe is present only if we believe in Ukraine. If we look from east to west, from north to south, if we use modern technologies, if we go from Urals to Atlantic, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic Sea, we realize that the geographic location of the European continent is Ukraine. The heart is in Ukraine. We know that the independence of such country, its vocation towards freedom and democracy, requires us for understand it. That's our commitment, the commitment we need from the new European Union Parliament. A new parliament which has the needs to find a balance and to take a leap forward towards a leadership, a new leadership. We have done many steps towards single currency, the European Central Bank. We have a high-profile bureaucracy with all its duties and rights. We have a political leadership in today's world where conflicts and dialogues move only between big countries. How can we compete with 1 billion 500 million people in China, 1 billion people living in India, countries like Russia or Europe without the European Union. With the fragmentation of the 27 countries, sovereign countries, is that the solution? No, it's not. The European Union leadership can take us towards integrity and integration. 70% of laws, it was said during a conference I attended recently, 70% of laws in Italy comes from the European Union law in a direct or indirect way, with directives implemented with national decrees. 70% of the laws that regulate and steer our country every day. We receive financing from the European Union with the National Plan for Recovery and Resilience, structural funds from the European Union. Tuscany is using 7.5 billion euros coming from Europe, 3.3 billion for structural investment, 683 million for other investments over the last 5 years and for the next 5 years. Without the European Union, we couldn't have done public works, for example. We owe a lot to the European Union. We don't receive enough money from our taxpayers, from our funds, national funds. Europe is among us. Let's turn it more and more integrated. Let's involve more and more future generations and new generations that feel European. Let's have a leadership that could integrate and unify, finally, after banks and finance, also from a political point of view. That's what we are wishing for. The State of the Union is so well organized in these days in Florence, and it has a strong significance in this sense. Thank you, and thank you by me and my Tuscany.
Grazie mille. Thank you so much as well for your opening words, for setting the context and also telling us your perspective on the state of Europe today. And we'd also like to bring up now the Secretary General of the EUI, who of course have brought us all together for this conference. That is Marco del Panta.
I'm the very last, sorry for that. President Giani was not the last one. Mr. High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, dear Ministers, Presidente della Regione, Vice Sindaco,
Deputy Mayor,
the 14th edition of the State of the Union Conference, which was opened yesterday by our new President, Patrizia Nance, at the Badia Fiesolana. In opening this final part of the conference, which started yesterday, my memory goes to the first edition, the one in 2011. In 2011, it was a novelty, it was a question mark. We didn't know how it would go, whether it would be a success or not. And I do remember the feeling we had together with Serena Burgisser, who is hiding somewhere, there she is, because the day before we didn't know whether people would come here to fill up the Salone dei 500, and we understood that it would be a success just the day before, when we knew that the Salone was full. So I'm very happy to see that also today this Salone is full. And if the initiative was a success at the beginning, I think that we owe it to two political personalities. One is Josep Borrell, who is here. At the time, he was the president of the Institute, former president of the European Parliament, and without his political weight, we would not have started this initiative, let me say so. And the second one was, I would say, the municipality of Florence, the mayor, but also the deputy mayor, Dario Nardella, who helped us a lot. and we owe very much also to the municipality, to the then deputy mayor and now mayor, if this initiative has started. Now, after 13 years, we are here again, and we have those two political personalities. There is Josep, Dario will join us in a second, and so that means that they have shared the main mission of this initiative, which is that of bringing the European Union close to the citizen. That is why we invented, that is why we started this initiative. And we think that we have done also in this year, we have been able, although the debates were quite technical, I mean, we think that given the high attendance also online of the debates, I think that we have given our contribution to bringing Europe close to its citizen. And we believe that in doing so, we are contributing somehow to the European construction. I mentioned our new president, Professor Patrizia Nans, who opened the conference yesterday. And I'd like to thank her also because she is here since 8 weeks, but she has created a very positive climate around this conference, and that is highly needed. It's highly needed also because we want to continue with this tradition. We have a number of partners, and if our new president will want, we will continue this way, and so we will be very glad to welcome you also in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marco Del Panta, and also Patrizia for opening yesterday and welcoming us all here to the State of the Union, the 14th edition. And you mentioned Josep Borrell, the EU Foreign Affairs Chief, being a very important person here every year at the conference. And I've had the privilege every year to sit down and have a chat with him, a catch up with him. And today is no exception. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the State of the Union, Josep Borrell, the EU Foreign Affairs Chief. I'd first like to invite you to deliver some opening remarks which reflect on the title of this panel, which is Security and Defence in Troubled Times for Europe. You can do them here, or if you want to take the podium, the floor is yours.
For 5 minutes. Thank you. As we say in Brussels, caro sindaco, caro presidente della regione, cara presidente dell'istituto.
Dear President, dear Mayor, dear Deputy Mayor,
Cari amici,
dear friends,
it's always a great pleasure. A great pleasure, caro sindaco and tutti, ritornare qui to this city, which illustrates the finest that the European has produced over its history. And within this institution, the European Institute, I see Kike Baron also here. Hello, Kike, how are you? My predecessor as President of the European Parliament. An institution to which I have been particularly attached. Europe is at the crossroad. How many times we have heard this expression? Yes, every time we say it's a crossroad. It is at the crossroad, and maybe now more than ever. Things has changed, and the European Union has to change its software. Some taboos has been broken to face the pandemic, to face the war of Russia against Ukraine, not yet to change our position with respect to the Middle East crisis, but we have to shake the system. It works too slowly to face the challenges and the speed of the world. I understand you perfectly. I understand you perfectly. We don't hear you.
And that. Thank you so much for your intervention. Thank you so much for your intervention. Your point has been very much taken.
Look, we heard you.
Thank you.
We heard you. Now maybe we could continue this event.
Indeed. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here and bringing in those points. These are the points that are being made at universities all across the continent of Europe. Even EU staffers have been taking to the street with that message. So thank you so much for being with us here today. And Josep Borrell, the High Representative, has heard your message loud and clear. So thank you very much. And now we invite the High Rep to continue. Thank you so much.
I understand perfectly the concern being expressed. Just today, the International Court of Justice has issued a statement asking or ordering Israel to stop the military actions in Gaza. I'm coming from Stanford, in California, and I see at this university more or less the same concern expressed by the students. And I was saying that the Europeans have to change our software, our decision-making process. It is too slow. It takes too long to take decisions. And the world is turning very quickly. First the pandemic, after the Russian aggression against Ukraine, after the dire situation in Gaza and the awful terrorist attack of Hamas that has created this extraordinary worrisome crisis in the Middle East. We Europeans, we have been building peace among us and building a network of relationship with the rest of the world based on trade. Trade and economic relations, believing that creating interdependencies would bring everybody to a universal peace. This has not happened. By the contrary, we live in a more multipolar world, much less multilateral, with more confrontation, more challenges, and not with a big advance of democracy, neither in countries like Russia or China and many in Africa. Now we have to face a different world, a world in which our security is at stake. And we have to reduce excessive dependencies. We have to create the capacity to defend ourselves in the framework of NATO, but being able to make a stronger contribution to NATO in one hand, and to build our own capacity of defense. This was not in the program of the founding fathers. European Union is not a military alliance, and we will not have an European army. But by the way, we have to increase our capacity to defend ourselves, and this means a lot of things that will be discussed during these elections and on the following legislature. I have a main message to pass to all of you. We need an urgent revolution in our mindset. Every European has to understand that the problems of the world will not be solved at the national state scale. We need a stronger and more united Europe, where defense and security will be key issues. Knowing that we come from different strategic cultures, that we don't understand the world in the same manner, from the Spanish to the Polish, from the Irish to the Germans. But if we want to survive in this challenging world, we have to be more united, and we have to have methods and procedures that allow us to respond quickly to the challenges of the world. I hope we will discuss about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks. And as we've seen there, even from the voices from the audience, and by the way, we will open the floor a little bit later as well if anyone else wants to make any points or questions. But the world is in a worse place than it was this time last year when we sat on this very stage. As you get ready now to pack up and finish your mandate and leave politics, how are you feeling? Do you feel you've gotten the job done?
Well, at the beginning of my mandate, I was told at the European Parliament, are you aware that your job is an impossible job? Well, it was an impossible job since the beginning, but nobody told me that I was going to face a pandemic and 2 wars, as a minimum. Many other things has happened. And I said at the beginning of my mandate, Europe has to learn to use the language of power. Europe has to be more assertive. Don't believe that just economic relationship will bring, as I said, peace and good relations. Interdependencies has become dependencies, and dependencies are dangerous. As we have seen with the dependency on Russia, on gas, and now we see on the China dependency on critical raw materials or on everybody needed for the digital and climate transformation. We have to understand that the world is not a Kantian world. And we have to use the capacity to influence with something more than just nice words and trade relations. Have we learned it? Not yet. In order to really be able to behave as a geopolitical actor, we have to be, as I said, more united and having another software, another method of decision, which requires that not everyone can block everything at any time and blackmail or to take hostages the decision process, asking for compensation in issue that has nothing to do with the one that we are discussing. And this will require a lot of political will. For example, European citizens, every time they have been asked by the Eurobarometer, they say, and they have said some days ago, that they want a stronger defense cooperation. They want more Europe for defense and security. They have been saying that for years. But the problem is that the political will at the level of the governments, who are the ones who matters, because defense is still a competence of the nation states, it's not a competence of the Commission, it's the competence of the states, they haven't been providing the political impetus for that. Then the war came, and we wake up. But one thing is to wake up, and another thing is to step up. One thing is to wake up, not to sleep, and another thing is to go out of the bed and start working. That we still haven't done. We started. But there is a lot of work, a lot of money, a lot of political will in order to build what the Europeans need today.
Indeed, as you say, mission impossible. And it was interesting, this week we saw the Weimar Triangle, a reinvigorated Weimar Triangle meet France, Germany and Poland, the foreign ministers asking, in fact, for more powers to be given to the EU's chief high rep. But Stephanie, you have a question now?
Sure, I'd like to turn, in your opening remarks, you actually mentioned NATO. And I think it's fair to say that the transatlantic relationship over the decades had its good times and not so good times. And Trump might have not been really the first president pushing the Europeans to invest much more in their security policy, right? If we just think of Obama, for example, he wanted to pivot to Asia and then was always drawn back to the European theater, but he wanted to push Europeans already to invest more in their security as well. But Trump might be particular because he also questioned the entire institutional framework in which the transatlantic relationship is actually embedded. So I think it's fair to say that he almost said that NATO is obsolete. And so in his second term, while he might not leave NATO because Congress has tried to make that really difficult for him, he nonetheless might just disengage from NATO completely. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more. I mean, in the European Union, we've discussed strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty, different terms were used, a defense industrial policy that you referred to as well. But is the EU really ready for a possible second Trump term?
Well, Trump was the ones who shake us and told us you are not spending enough in defense. And he was right. He said that in a very tough manner, but he was right. We are spending on defense overall about 1.5, 1.6 of the European GNP. Russia spends 6.5, and the US 3.5. So we are far away of the effort that is required to have our capacities in the field of defense. At the same time, I have to repeat once and again, there is not alternative to NATO for the territorial defense of Europe. Today, there is not alternative to NATO. And for a long time, we have been discussing a false dilemma. Do we need NATO or do we need strategic autonomy? We need both. Now this dilemma is being solved. We need a strong NATO, a reliable NATO, and inside NATO we have to build a strong European Union pillar of defense. And for that we need to become stronger. But it is not one thing or the other. Another question is who is going to do the US in the future, depending who is at the White House. For years, we have been delegating our defense and security issues to the US. We should not continue delegating. We have to take our responsibility. And that's why instead of talking about strategic autonomy, I prefer to talk about strategic responsibility. We have to take our responsibility in our hands. Altogether, the Europeans spend in military, before the war in Ukraine, 4 times what Russia was spending. Now it's just the contrary. And if we want to face this situation, we have to increase our capacity, not to go out of NATO, but to become stronger inside NATO. And the stronger we will be, the stronger will be the interest of the US to make the European Union and the NATO working together. So no longer a dilemma. We need both things at the same time. The question mark is what the US are going to do depending on who is going to rule.
But you have a little spanner in the works there when it comes to NATO. Just this morning, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, in an interview said that he wants to, quote, redefine Hungary's relationship with NATO in this new era of support for Ukraine. How do you deal with a troublemaker like that when you're talking here about the need for unity and a strong Europe speaking with one voice?
I don't know what does it mean by redefining the relationship with NATO. It's a quite undefined assessment. Redefine in which sense?
It means not allowing Ukraine ever to become a member of NATO. It means reducing support to Ukraine. We've seen Viktor Orban many times pushing back when it comes to joining the joint stance on sanctions against Russia, etc.
Look, the support to Ukraine was built from the beginning with a strong unity among Europeans. And thanks to this unity, we have been able to provide to Ukraine military support, financial support, humanitarian and economic support. Today, at about 90 billion euros, 90 billion euros, more than the US. More overall. Less on the military side, not negligible, but more if we add up military, civilian, economic, and humanitarian. And whatever proposal comes, we have to continue doing that. Otherwise, Ukraine will not be able to resist this 6-month delay on the US arguing in the Congress about do we support Ukraine, we don't support Ukraine, we don't support Ukraine, we support Ukraine. 6-month delay has had a high cost in terms of lives and in terms of weakness of the Ukrainians in the front line. And every time that we delay a decision, there is a bill paid in lives. So if we want Ukraine to continue defending itself, we have to continue supporting them. I know how to finish this war. I know. We stop supporting Ukraine and the war will finish in a week. But how? You will have a puppet government in Kyiv. You will have this Ukrainian society crushed by the Russian oppression. You will have the Russian troops on the Polish border. You will have Russia controlling 45% of the world market of grains. And you will have Putin saying, it worked, let's try again with someone else. So this is what I think whatever Orban or whoever says, we have to do. And what worries me is that at that moment, the unity of the Europeans starts being a little bit put into question, because not everybody wants to participate on the military support. That being said, we have to work on the diplomatic side, and we will do that on the next 14 and 15 of June in Geneva. All wars finish with a stalemate or a peace agreement. Some cases, like in the Korea case, there is not peace agreement. It's just stopping war, not peace, but not war. This is the big question for us. How do we end this war? It will depend on us, not only on the Ukrainians. And this is a message that during this electoral process, European citizens has to answer. What do they want to do? Because depending on the composition of the parliament, the answer to this question will be one or another.
And these answers might not be very easy to find. As you said yourself again in your opening remarks, you want a stronger and a more united Europe, but actually this coherence and this unity is not always easy to achieve. So for example, when it's about taking positions on activities that are going on either in Gaza, in Georgia, or in Ukraine actually, it's very hard to achieve agreement among EU member states. If at all, actually sometimes one member state has to ask another member state to go on coffee break, right? As has happened between Orban and Scholz, and when they used constructive abstention. So I'd like to ask a little bit more. You said qualified majority voting might be one way to actually create more coherence, but is it actually the only way to create more unity among EU member states? And maybe a little bit more provocatively, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about whether coherence and unity is always a sign of strength of the European Union. Because couldn't we also say that sometimes there's strength in disunity, especially if the European Union wants to not portray itself as it, the West, against the rest?
Yes, this is something important. We have to avoid that the world goes to a kind of a fight between the West, and we are part of the West, against the rest of the world. Finish the two blocks against each other, finish the big hegemon. There is a multipolar world, and many countries which are very important today, and they didn't exist in the aftermath of the Second World War, wants to be actors of the geopolitical landscape, and others are hedging. They are not with you, they're not with the others. It depends on the day, it depends on the matter, and it depends on the alternative and the concrete offer that we can provide to them. And we have to avoid that the Russia vision of the world, based on the double standards of the West, look, what do you do? Ukraine is one thing, Gaza is another thing, conquers the mind of the people and creates a kind of a great coalition against the West, who at the end is practicing double standards. This is the most important battle for our geopolitical role. And for that, yes, qualified majority decision making would help. But it's not the only thing that we need. When I'm saying that we have to change the software, it's not only the decision-making process, it's the mindset. And this will require a strong political engagement and a strong pedagogy towards European citizens. We don't share the same vision of the world. That's a fact. The position of Germany with respect to the war in Gaza is completely different than the position of Spain, for historical reasons, easy to understand. And the position against the war, with respect to the war in Iraq, is completely different from Poland to the Spain, because the historical reasons. We have to overcome that situation and create a common strategic culture, a common understanding of the world. And I know it's easy said, but we have to do it. Otherwise, we will not be a geopolitical actor. In the States, you live in Arkansas, you live in Alaska, you live in Miami, you have the same understanding of the threats. But in Europe, if you live in Vilnius, or you live in Lisbon and Athens, you don't have the same understanding of the threats. And this is what the Europeans has to build, a common understanding of the world. A lot of pedagogy, a lot of political and intellectual work has to be done. And the European University Institute can contribute to it. All the universities, more debate about what is Europe about, how the world works, who is who represents whom. We have to engage in a much more intellectual and shared process, not only the government, but ordinary citizens. And this is what is missing in the European project. And
who is who, indeed? Who do you call when you want to speak to Europe? That is the question always. Who should fill your shoes then, Josep Borrell, going forward?
what, sorry?
Who should fill your shoes? Who should be the next Foreign Affairs Chief, do you think?
Who should be? I don't know. I don't know. But I wish him luck.
Or her, him?
I wish him the best success, because he has to do two different things at the same time. He has to engage with the rest of the world, and he has to engage with the European Union actors. He has to be acting outside and inside. He has to create consensus inside the European Union, not only among the states, but also between the European institutions, the Council and the Commission. And then he has to go to the rest of the world and to present a united position. And when there is not a united position, then he has to take some risk and to push, and not to be silent but to try to present alternatives to the debate. For example, in the war in Gaza, it has been a big dividing issue among us. When we vote in the United Nations General Assembly, 18 vote in favor of the ceasefire, 2 vote against, and the others abstain. Well, it's difficult to represent the European Union position like this, because that is not the European Union position. It's a basic one, freedom of hostages, increased humanitarian support, and building of the two-state solution. But then you go to be in concrete actions, not just rhetoric declarations, but to build it. For example, let's see which is going to be the answer of the European Union to the ruling of the International Court of Justice that has been issued today, which is going to be our position. We will have to choose between our support to the international institution and the rule of law or our support to Israel. And both things is going to be quite difficult to make compatible.
And the EU, of course, has been accused of double standards in its handling of this situation. This is coming up day in, day out. You can see the anger across the continent among civil society, among students, and also among EU staffers. They've been writing letters as well to you, criticising the handling of the European Union here. Is this something that keeps you up at night? Because as you say, you can't really say how you feel because you don't have that competence as the High Representative.
Certainly not. Nobody cares about my personal opinion. When I'm saying something, it's because I have the European Union behind me, otherwise, who cares? And certainly we have to clearly say that we reject and condemn the terrorist attack of Hamas. They are heinous, and I have to repeat the same thing that we have been saying, that Israel has the right to defend, certainly, but this right to defend has to be implemented in accordance with international law and international humanitarian law. And the question is, does it happen? It's not enough to say. The question is, does it happen? And if it doesn't happen, what to do? And this is something that the Europeans have to discuss more, because by the time being, we haven't been able to look for a unified position in something which is, what can I say, is dividing among us. And I cannot go further than the consensus among us, but I have to push for a consensus. On Monday, we will have in Brussels the 5 foreign affairs ministers of the most important Arab countries, from Jordan, from Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, from Emirates, from Qatar, the Arab League. And we will try to establish a dialogue between the Europeans and the Arabs in order to break this stalemate and to try to look for a solution, a political solution, because there is not a military solution to the conflict in the Middle East. It's not just by war that this will be solved. This is the 100 years war. But this political solution requires a strong engagement of the international community, starting by us. Otherwise, it will not be a solution, and we will go from funerals to funerals, generation after the generations, complaining about a situation which hurts our feeling. This is something that the Europeans have to, not the European people, but the European governments, understand and engage. I hope that on Monday, the visit of the Arabs to the Brussels Foreign Affairs Council will represent a political push in this direction.
If there's anyone in the audience who'd like to pose a question, get ready. We can bring a microphone down to you. And in the meantime, Stephanie, you have a question?
Just one more brief question, which is very, very broad. Given your experience both on the national and the EU level with the foreign policy portfolio, so I mean, you were privy to a lot of information, you work in networks that also distribute lots of information. I'd just be curious, if I figuratively would give you like a crystal ball now and you would have to look into it and tell me how the world looks like in 10 years' time, what kind of world do you expect to see? And I will try to pick up on Maeve's question again. Who in the European Union will have led the EU into this direction? Because there are names obviously circulating. Some mention people more in the Baltic states, in Poland or Luxembourg. Do you see anybody who is positioning themselves already for the job?
The second question is a delicate one. I don't think I can make a positive contribution to that, mentioning one or the other. It's not my role to pick up my successor. The world in 10 years, well, the big structural issue today is the confrontation between China and US. This is the big thing. The emerging power, and I wouldn't say the decaying power, but the established power. This will define the world of tomorrow, which is the role of China with respect to US in this new geopolitical landscape. And we Europeans, we should try not to be squeezed on this confrontation. We have to take care of our interests also. We will be always closer to the US, certainly. We share the same political system, the same economic system. But on these giant confrontations, the European has to look at our own interests and take care of how things are going on. For example, if the US puts a big tariff to the imports of the electric cars from China, which, by the way, they are almost not importing electric cars from China. It is a kind of preventive tariffs. Where the Chinese cars will go? Guess where? In Europe, no? So we have to work in a coordinated manner with the US and trying to say, well, look, here we are. And then there are three trends which are accelerating and will define the world of tomorrow. The first is climate change. It's accelerating, and you cannot imagine how many climate refugees we will have coming from Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa, where hundreds of thousands of people will not be able to live because nobody will be able to live at these high temperatures. This is a trend which is accelerating. It's not for tomorrow, it's for today. The second trend is the demographic one. We are becoming older and older and smaller with respect to the rest of the world. We are 5% of the world population, and our average age is twice, double, the average age of our neighbors from Gibraltar to the Caucasus. The unbalance, the demographic unbalance of the world will define a lot of conflicts. And the third one is the technological trend. We are lagging behind. The new technologies. I'm coming from Stanford, from California, visiting the big firms that they didn't exist some years ago, and now they are the biggest capitalization in the world. Technology, demography, and climate change will define the world to tomorrow. And in this world, we, Europeans, we will not represent the same thing that we represented in the past. So wake up, my dear citizens of Europe. Face these challenges, demographic one, technological one, and environmental one. And one thing, let me finish with that. When we go and we talk with the people in the third world, emerging countries, which are much lower level of development than us, and we tell them, you have to fight against climate change. They tell us, oh, yes, we have. But you have to do it much more than us because you created the problem. You created the problem and we are suffering the consequences. And you know what? I don't have the same priorities than you because my level of development is much lower. And you have a strong responsibility and you have to support me in order to fight against climate change. Otherwise, I will not do. Because it's not my first priority. My first priority is to give my people food for tomorrow. And this is something that we have to understand. For us, it's quite logical and natural. But we are 8% of the world emissions on CO2. Even if tomorrow the Europeans cancel all emissions, they probably will remain the same. So the important thing is our support to the others to do our policies, to follow our policies. Otherwise, the result will be damaging for our competitivity and will not solve the climate problem. And keep in mind, the demographic unbalance is playing against us. The Europeans need a lot of migrants. We need them. It has to be a regular process. It has to be under control. We have to fight against the human being smugglers. We have to fight against irregular migration. But it's utopical to believe that the European society can survive only with our demographic strength. Because reproduction well, takes some procedures. And by the time being, I don't see the demographic boost of the Europeans being able to keep our size in the world. This is something that European societies have to understand.
Okay, a lot at stake. And a number of the topics you mentioned there, we dived into over the last 2 days over all those panels. I'm just looking around the room to see, would anyone like to pose a question to the High Representative? Yeah, we have a gentleman there. Anyone else? So we can take a couple at a time.
Try to speak loud and clear.
The acoustics.
I have a microphone.
Just introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Friedrich Puttmann from the London School of Economics, and you just mentioned the issue of refugees and migrants, and I have a question on the European neighborhood, which is very short. How would you define the EU's relationship with Turkey these days?
Thank you so much for your question. Any other questions? Okay.
The
relationship with Turkey.
With Turkey.
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 To be more politically correct, yes.
Turkey is a candidate country. For years, it has been, and it still is, a candidate country. But the process of adhesion has been slowing down, and now is in a stalemate situation. And frankly, when I see the last decision that has been taken, I see from the Turkish side a lot of complaints saying that we don't take them seriously into consideration, and believing that we are no longer interested in Turkey becoming a member of the European Union. That's what they believe. And it's important for the Europeans to decide what do we want to do with Turkey. We cannot continue keeping this sleeping status quo, because more and more Turkey is taking another direction, not converging with our values and rules, but looking for a decision from our side. And this decision has not come. And they complain, and they regularly complain when they say, look, you exclude the Turkish companies from the Ukrainian reconstruction fund, or you don't invite us to the meetings where you invite other candidates. This kind of relationship, which is ni fu ni fa, is not, I consider you seriously a candidate, but I don't abandon it, is something that is unsustainable. And in the next legislature, the responsibles and the European Union Council, the leaders, will have to say what kind of relationship do we want to have with Turkey.
And just briefly on EU enlargement, on Georgia. Is Georgia's future in the European Union, given their recent foreign agents bill?
Well, we are strongly concerned by this law on foreign agents. And this certainly doesn't make Georgia to be on the European path. And we have been telling them, on the other hand, we have to be very careful not to hurt their nationalist feeling. This is something in which we have to use a soft language and at the same time a clear position with respect what is compatible and what is not with the European path. On Georgia, with respect to this law, but there are other countries who are not aligning with the foreign policy of the European Union. Serbia, for example, it's a very low rate of alignment with the foreign policy of the European Union. And this is something that has to be also remarked. If you want to be a member of the European Union, you have to align on the rule of law, on the freedom, and on the foreign policy positions.
Okay. We have more questions, but we're out of time. I don't know if we're allowed to steal another 2 minutes. I think we are. No? Just one.
Jean-Michel Glachan, France School of Regulation, EUI. Mr. Borrell, 3 European countries moved to recognize Palestine as a legitimate state. Will this accelerate the repositioning of the EU, or is this repositioning depending much more on other countries like, say, Germany and Czech Republic?
Thank you so much for your question. And the lady there, and then you give a short conclusion.
Hello. Just continuing on enlargement topic, and you mentioned Serbia, which has not aligned with the common foreign security policy fully. But at the same time, we know that the Serbian government is actually both in terms of the values, but also in terms of its international cooperation, actually going farther and farther away from being a true EU accession candidate. So do you think that the EU is actually losing its appeal in the Western Balkans? And what will be the future of EU's enlargement policy in the Western Balkans if it loses Serbia the way it lost Turkey?
Thank you so much for your questions.
Do you have easy questions? No, I understand. It depends, mon cher Monsieur Relation. It depends to whom you are asking. I'm sure that Spain and Ireland and Slovenia and maybe tomorrow others believe honestly that recognition is a political push for the two-state solution. But I know that there are other members of the European Union who believe the contrary, that they believe that it could be counterproductive because it's not the moment. What can I do? For me, one thing is clear. Recognition is not supporting Hamas. And on that, I have to really contest the positions expressed by the Israeli government saying that recognition is a gift to Hamas or supporting terrorism. Just by the contrary. Let me be logical. The Palestinian world is divided in two bands. The Hamas, that we consider a terrorist organization, and the Palestinian Authority, which is the nucleus of the future possible Palestinian state, with whom we have good relationship. I will meet with the Prime Minister of Palestine on Monday in Brussels. We pay about 500 million euros per year in supporting the Palestinian Authority. They go to the United Nations. So when we recognize the Palestinian statehood, to whom are we supporting? To the Hamas branch or to the Palestinian Authority branch? Certainly to the Palestinian Authority branch, no? So it's a good way, it's a good position. It's unfunded, completely unfunded and unacceptable to say that recognition, be or not counterproductive, is a matter of giving gifts to Hamas or expressing anti-Semitism. Nothing of that. It's a political decision that someone believes that this is going to push for the two-state solution. This is not the common understanding of the European Union, and we will have to continue discussing about that. And on Serbia, it's clear that there is not an alignment in the foreign policy of Serbia with respect to Russia and respect to China. And the recent visit of President Xi to Serbia shows it clearly. But you can tell me that the same thing can be said about the visit of President Xi to Hungary, exactly in the same terms. The difference is Hungary is inside the European Union and Serbia is not in the European Union. But the position with respect to China is more or less the same thing and quite divergent with respect to the general policy of the European Union. And you know what? The process of enlargement was a long queue who was stalled, blocked, paralyzed for years and years. And suddenly, a big country appears by the end of the queue, Ukraine. And now this is pushing, and pushing hard. So either Ukraine jumps above the queue, which is difficult to believe and justify, or Ukraine will be pushing the whole queue and accelerating the process in one direction or the other. So the next legislature will be the moment of truth with respect to our position towards the enlargement. Just because there is a big one pushing on the end of the queue and making the queue to move, and either the queue moves or the queue will be broken.
Thank you so much, Josep Borrell. You've been so generous with your time. A round of applause there for the High Representative. Thank you. And thank you so much to Stephanie Hoffman there, Professor Stephanie Hoffman from the EUI as well. So that brings this opening ceremony of the State of the Union Part 2 to an end. Now we will have parallel sessions, so I think you should know which one you are registered for. If you are registered for the session that includes Nadia Calvino, from the President of the EIB, that will be moderated by the Financial Times journalist Pelita Clark, then you can stay exactly where you are. You are in the right place. Otherwise, if you're registered for the digital public infrastructure, you need to go to the Sala Lorenzo il Magnifico. Enjoy the panels and see you later. Thank you so much for your attention. We can now commence our next panel, which is entitled Investing in the Mediterranean Neighbourhood as part of the EU's new geopolitical context. For this panel will be moderated by Joss and Ms. Clark from the Financial Times, but the President of the EIB, the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg, Nadia Calvino, was very kind to prepare a message for us for this conference that we can have a look at right now.
Hello, dear Joss, panelists. I am very happy to join you for this important event and on a subject that, as you know, is at the heart of the European Investment Bank Group's mission. Only a few weeks ago, I was in Washington, where the message from the IMF and the World Bank spring meetings was, the economy is performing better than expected, geopolitics is worse. Conflict, tensions, fragmentation will be very much part of the new landscape for the foreseeable future. And for the European Union, this means that we need to focus on strengthening ties with our partners and neighbours, on our eastern border, in North Africa and the Middle East. And the European Investment Bank can play an important role through projects and investments that help the economy and thereby contribute to improving also the geopolitical situation. We need to direct our support more strategically for more impact, to support growth, jobs and prosperity in our Mediterranean neighbours, and accompany them in the transition towards a more sustainable, climate-resilient future for all. Our commitment to climate action in this region is not only altruistic, to improve the lives of citizens now and the future opportunities of younger generations, it is also strategic. Climate action is a key driver of stability, resilience and energy security of the region. By jointly investing in sustainable solutions in key sectors such as water, energy, transport, we not only mitigate the impact of climate change, but also contribute to a more stable and prosperous future for citizens on both shores of the Mediterranean. The European Investment Bank Group, through its global initiatives, is at the forefront of European efforts to catalyse investments that align with these strategic objectives. We are backing partnerships and projects that reflect Europe's commitment to mutually beneficial, sustainable development and climate resilience in the region. To name just a few, the ELMED interconnector will allow renewable energy to flow across borders between Sicily and Tunisia. The inclusive and sustainable forest project in Morocco will protect the environment, support our natural defences against climate change and promote sustainable tourism. And the Aqaba Amman desalination and conveyance project will dramatically improve water security in Jordan by providing 300 million cubic meters of clean water a year. In order to reap the opportunities both in the EU and for our Mediterranean partners and accelerate the transition towards a low-carbon economy, we need to leverage the power of strategic partnerships and industrial cooperation. New cooperation opportunities, including the development of hydrogen production and transport infrastructure, the expansion of renewable energy production and modernizing of electricity transmission networks, these all offer important avenues for collaboration and mutual benefit. There are also opportunities in the digital arena, and at the EIB we are very proud to have joined our partners and the European Commission as financiers of the Medusa fibre optic cable, which will bring high-speed connectivity to 5 EU Mediterranean countries, as well as Algeria, Egypt, Morocco and Tunisia. The project is a real game changer, a tangible expression of Europe's global gateway strategy. The Medusa underwater cable is also providing direct terrestrial links to universities and education and research centers in North Africa countries. This will support ties with EU peer organizations, deepening scientific knowledge exchange and boosting innovation, research and job creation in the region. Partnership is the key word here. Through dialogue and by building trust, we aim to pursue common interests and create a shared vision for a prosperous and resilient future that we can invest in. The EU-Egypt Strategic and Comprehensive Partnership announced in March and the Green Partnership on Energy, Climate and the Environment that the EU and Morocco signed in 2022 also demonstrate that what we have in mind. These initiatives, which are led by the local governments and the EIB Group, help implement and show the European Green Deal's international dimension in action. Europe shares more than just the sea with its Mediterranean neighbors. We share many common interests. Through strategic investments, collaborative partnerships, and a commitment to sustainability, we can work towards a better future together. Thank you, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion. Bye.
Thank you, Mrs. President of the European Investment Bank. I have the pleasure to sketch out what we are going to discuss today. And as was indicated, the geopolitical reality is changing fast. We heard that in the previous session. The political reality around the Green Deal is changing fast. The legislation is there, it's being implemented. The emissions are going down, that's all good news, but there are headwinds. Headwinds internally, because there are questions about affordability. There are questions about the amount of investments that have to be brought forward, as the President just highlighted. So internally there are questions. One of the jewels on the crown is the carbon market. The carbon price is very good. It incentivizes the low carbon investments, but we have to watch at our trade with external partners. And so the part of the Green Deal was a European carbon border. And this carbon border adjustment led to some questions by trade partners. So that's the second element. The third element is, as we just saw, that the trade orientation of the EU must have to change. We have the war in Ukraine, we have the war in the Mediterranean. We see that we have to rebalance our orientation on energy trade, on raw materials trade, and so the neighborhood comes into much more focus. And the focus of our debate here today is going to be about that, this changing reality, in particular in the Mediterranean. So that's the context for our debate. Some headwinds, some challenges, but perhaps also some opportunities. So Pilita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jos, and hello. It's a great pleasure to be here today. My name is Pilita Clark. I'm an associate editor and columnist at the Financial Times, where we look at the topic of today's discussion very, very often, and it's terrific to have such a great panel of speakers who are going to be able to help us analyse where we are and where we need to go from the perspective of business, civil society, and the European Commission. So Jos and I will be co-moderating. We'll kick off with a discussion on our panel. We'll have a bit of time towards the end for audience questions, and then Jos will be summing up. So let me introduce our panel. To my right, we have Evangelos Mytilineos, who's the Chairman and Chief Executive of Mytilineos Energy and Metals, which is a global industrial and energy company based in Greece, involved in everything from solar farms to aluminium production and natural gas trading. It has more than 5,000 employees in more than 30 countries. Laurence Tubiana, to my extreme right, is the Chief Executive of the European Climate Foundation, which is one of the world's largest climate philanthropies, and Laurence was previously France's climate change ambassador and special representative to COP21, and is therefore a key architect of the 2015 Paris Agreement. And finally, Kurt Vandenberg is the Director General of the European Commission's Climate Action Directorate. He's also known as a godfather of the Green Deal as a result of his work as a Green Policy Advisor in the Office of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and he previously headed policy development at the Commission's Research Directorate, where he helped to draft the Horizon Europe Scientific Research Venture. Now, Kurt, I want to start off with you if we can, and I wonder if you can just paint us a picture. We heard there from the head of the EIB about some of the projects that are underway, are being planned around the Mediterranean. Can you give us a sense of roughly how many other sorts of investment ventures and initiatives there are of that ilk, and how many we might expect to see on current investment trajectories in, say, 5 or 10 years' time?
Yeah. No, happy to answer this question, and first of all, thank you for devoting some attention to climate and energy in this State of the Union. It's very good that we can also discuss this. Let me start by saying, Pelita, that there is a growing and general awareness that the green transition is existential for the world, but it's even more existential for Europe. Not only for ecological reasons, but maybe even more for economic reasons, because we know, we have learned the hard way, that we can't sustain our economic model on the basis of fossil fuels. And we also see what is good for the climate, by the way, that the rest of the world is going very quickly as well in greening. IRA in the United States, renewables in China, exporting all the green technologies to the rest of the world. And it's also very much a security agenda, not only in terms of our dependence on imports of fossil fuels, but also in view of the big climate risks that we will be facing in the future. So for the EU, it would be nonsensical not to stay the course on this green or clean transition. We may call it differently. It may not be painted in green in the future, but it's really what we're doing with this transition is a program of vast and deep economic modernization. And it all hinges on investment. And that's why it was so good that Nadia Galvino spoke here. She said it exactly right. What we really need in Europe to modernize our economy and protect or reinforce our competitiveness and productivity for the future is massive investment. We need to realize that investment in China is 40% of GDP. In Europe, it's 20%. We're not saying that we should become like China.
You're meaning investment in green energy ventures?
Investment in general.
Oh, sorry, yeah, right, yeah.
And this is since many years. So we have a lot of catch-up to do, and that's why I'm so happy that the EIB is saying in its draft roadmap for 24-27 that financing the green transition is Europe's strategic priority #1 because it guarantees sustainable growth, technological competitiveness, strategic autonomy and security. I couldn't say it better than what the EIB is doing. And the good news is that we're on track. We're on track with this transition. We have reduced emissions since 1990 by close to 35%. Our economy has grown by close to 70% over that same period. The last year, 23 compared to 22, we saw a decrease in emissions of close to 10%, while our economy continued to grow. We have historic levels of unemployment. We have increasing levels of investment. Actually, we see that our pipeline of projects, for example, in the Innovation Fund, is overflowing. We have an oversubscription of 6 compared to the budgets we have. Very different to 10 years ago, when President Juncker rightly proposed the Juncker investment plan. He brought a lot of money to the table, but we had no projects. We had to look for projects everywhere. Now, thanks to the European Green Deal, we have actually a multitude of projects, and we need to bring the money to these projects. And maybe something that is also counterintuitive is that our trade surplus is growing. And in January this year, our Eurozone trade surplus was the highest since 2002. So we are on track. It doesn't mean that everything is rosy. We also see a decline in industrial output, and that is a reason for concern. That's why we need a true industrial policy. We from DG Klima are now the strongest advocates for an industrial policy, and I'm happy to announce that today the European Council adopted Council conclusions on a true European industrial policy, which is really keeping the course on the digital and the green transition. So what I would like to say is that we have everything in place now with the regulatory framework for 2030. We now need to make it happen, implement. We're done with regulation. We need to implement what we have. We need to mobilize the massive investments that are needed, very significant but doable. We obviously need to have a proper industrial policy in place, and that will happen because we need it. And we need to look beyond our borders.
Okay, so that's a great point to bring in Evangelos, actually. So we've had a very bullish assessment there of how well the Green Deal is doing, and everything's on track, essentially, we're being told. Is that what it feels like when you're running a company like Mytilineos?
I wish I could agree, but I'm sorry, I cannot exactly agree with this statement. As the president of the European Metals Association, Eurometal, I have to say that probably half of the European non-ferrous metals plants, as we speak, they are shut. Why they are shut? Mostly because the cost of energy in Europe is maybe 2 or 3 times higher than it is in the United States or China. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers, maybe a million others that depend on the existence of these factories. So I do not exactly see a very rosy picture for this broader sector.
And your company's been complaining, as have many others, about the high cost of energy in the EU for some time. And do you think that your complaints are not getting through, or do you think there are bigger obstacles to getting change done? What's your assessment of what the main problem is?
As we speak, we are at the crossroads for the next wave of decarbonization of energy. A lot of money has been spent in the last years, some with subsidies, some without, with the full merchant risk. And so I think we have arrived at the stage where more than set goals for decarbonized energies produced in Greece, in renewables, wind, solar, more and more. Now, what is the problem? In most countries in Europe, we have arrived at a point where we produce more renewable energy than we can consume. Why is that? Because the grid cannot afford so much energy at a certain period within the day. And that brings the price down to zero or negative. And then the regulator or the administrator has to shut off in order not to be a complete blackout. So what does that mean? It means that the investments in green energy, the yield of the investments is coming down, and therefore we can anticipate a slowdown. Why is that? Because at the moment the technology does not provide for battery storage. We are not there yet.
It's too expensive.
And also green hydrogen.
Right, I do want to get on to green hydrogen. Now, just before I go to Laurence, Kurt, can you just very quickly answer Evangelos's point there about there being a problem with the Green Deal, in as much as for some sectors of industry, energy prices are just too high?
Energy prices are too high in Europe, but the answer is not to keep things as they are. We don't want to see deindustrialization in Europe. We need to keep these strategic industry sectors, but what we need now is an industrial transformation. And this is not easy. This requires investment. We are very much aware of this. I think we have listened recently through the industry roundtables to what the industry is saying, and last month we brought out a document in which we clearly say how we want to make sure that we support this industrial transformation. One is on energy. The energy prices are a structural handicap for Europe. So the best thing to do now is to invest in renewables, ramp up renewables, invest in the grids, the pipelines, the storage for CO2, etc. I think we've also clearly said that this will cost money. That should not come at the expense or on the balance sheet of industrial companies. So we are advocating to exempt the energy-intensive industries from network tariffs, because otherwise it's not possible to carry all these investments. Secondly, access to funding needs to improve a lot. There is a lot of money in the European system, including from the public budget, but it's very fragmented. So we need to start pooling this and really create a capital markets union to channel all the savings that we have for transition finance. And you see in the electoral debate how important the capital markets union will be, also looking at Mr. Letta's report. Thirdly, we need to create green lead markets. Green lead markets. Okay. Markets that ensure to companies that make the investment in green products that there will be an off-taker, even if the prices will be higher. For that we need to use public procurement, the innovation fund we have at European level, etc. And last point is of course ensuring a global level playing field.
Okay.
And the best thing to do is to make sure that there is a global carbon pricing system in place. And that's why the European Commission has recently decided to create a task force on international carbon pricing diplomacy, which has started operating last month. And we actually met this week with major ETS jurisdictions in the world, including China, including Brazil. They're all ramping up their ETS system, and that actually will, over time, create a global level playing field. So
okay, well that's really interesting. I mean, I saw a bit of a twitch of a smile, I think, when you mentioned the global idea of a global carbon market or global carbon pricing on the face of Laurence there, because it's something that's been talked about for a long, long time. It'd be great if anything could come to fruition there. Laurence, I just wonder, from your perspective, at the European Climate Foundation, what does the Green Deal look like right now to you? And is there a sense at all that there's a risk, from your perspective, that as the EU understandably pursues geopolitical and strategic themes in its investment outlook, that climate priorities might get downgraded or overlooked?
So, one fact we have to recognize is that this green transition is underway. And it has been really amplified after the Paris Agreement, when the Chinese investment started even 5 years before. So the train has left the station. So then the question is, are we lagging behind, or are we just looking at the future? And sometimes I feel that the hesitation, the demand for delay or for pause are really not realistic, given the level of the global competition. That said, there is a lot of fragmentation, and that's true that of course, I think we have to double down on the Green Deal, frankly. But of course, putting the social element now up front, because if not, the societies who sometimes doesn't know even we have a Green Deal could understand and own this transition. The second element is that we have to on one side, I don't think we can do the green transition alone. That isn't realistic. We are in a global market. We are anyway at that stage heavily dependent on imports from China, but it's not forever. And now I think it's a moment for EU to redefine its relation of partnership with many more partners. And that, because again, and that's a good sign, even if we are going very, very too slowly, many countries are embarking on that direction. Brazil, as Kurt was saying, it's a good example, but many others are doing it. So I think it's a moment where Europe is not no more meaning can patronize and say we are the leader in the Green Deal and the transition, but we offer new partnerships that will allow us to diversify our relation, in particular on critical materials, in particular in trying to get out of this, model of extraction of critical material for one country and just for our industrialization, but thinking along the supply chain, what kind of distributed benefit we can offer. And that, in my view, it's exactly the good response to the conflictual geopolitical context we are in. And that means a different diplomacy that exactly Kurt was referring to. We need even a different diplomacy to combine coalition from countries coming from the developing world and the developed world to tax these global flows who are not paying anything. Aviation, which the Commission is working hardly on that, is a very good example. So I think we are at a totally new phase of diplomacy. We are totally new phase of redefining our partnership. Mediterranean, of course, is neighbors, so we have to be really conscious about that. Sometimes we have neglected that very much, looking only pivoting to Asia, but there are really other regions we were investing. So that's why, and I see, again, CBAM, you were talking about that, Jos, and you, to Kurt. Now the discussion is changing incredibly. 7 or 8 months ago, I was always attacked on the CBAM in many panels by my colleagues from different diplomacies around the world. Now they say how we use it, how we can finally do the job in our country, how we put export tax to keep the revenues, but then to put a carbon price at home. And that is a trend. So we should not delay, we should double down, because I think that's a major choice we have to do. And I hope whatever happens with the European election, there will be this realism that we should not change the direction of travel.
Okay, so you've mentioned the E word, the election. We're just a couple of weeks away from these European Parliament elections. How are you all feeling about the outcome? Do you worry, any of you, that the outcome could derail the Green Deal? Laurence, what's your view? We obviously don't know what the outcome's going to be, but there's been some concern that depending on how certain parties do, there may be pressure to water down or move away from the Green Deal. Is that something that you think is realistic or not?
Yes, I think we can be worried to see climate change taken in hostage by some political movement. It's just stupid. I mean, we cannot, because we like or we don't like climate change, that this will not happen anyway. And again, green transition, again, is underway in US, in China, elsewhere. So I hope somehow, after the campaign and the gesticulation, the political ones, people in the parliament will recognize that anyway, climate change is hurting Europe very much, and the only way to control this damage is to make alliances with many other big emitters to really control this emission. And again, even if we don't like climate change, it's not a political issue. Unfortunately, we could negotiate. We can't negotiate with climate change, frankly.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm worried.
Evangelist, Kurt, what are you thinking about the elections? I mean, do you think there is a legitimate danger that, depending on the outcome, it could make your job in particular extremely difficult?
Well, of course, the elections will be very important. But when I look back at 2019, in 2019, the outcome of the elections was all green. We were surfing on a wave of public demand with all parties, except the extremes, asking for green ambition. But we were alone in the world. Remember, Donald Trump had withdrawn the US from the Paris Agreement. Today, the opposite is happening. We see growing concerns in our public about the cost of this transition, often legitimate. We cannot dismiss this. Very often also fueled by political polarization, which may die down a bit after the elections, but also fueled by disinformation, which is a big worry for us. But as Laurence was saying, we're no longer alone in the world.
No.
We actually risk being overtaken in what we thought was Europe's comparative advantage in clean tech and greening of our economy. So that means that everyone will realize that staying the course is essential for this. But what we now need to do is not to add regulation, I'm quite confident that we have everything in place in terms of regulation for achieving our 2030 goals. We need to make sure that we use the tools we have and the resources for ensuring a socially just transition to allay these concerns in the public. And we need to work with business that is telling us, please stay the course, because if you know change, we don't know what the direction is anymore, but we need a targeted industrial policy to help the industrial transformation that we really need. Where I'm a bit more concerned, to close on this, is that we also need to prepare the next decade for after 2030. And that's, of course, where the composition of the next parliament will be determining quite a bit.
Yeah. And Evangelos, what about you? Can you respond to Kirk there? I mean, is that correct, that really what you're waiting for is for the formation of an industrial policy? And how concerned are you about the outcome of the elections?
Very interesting points from the panelists here. There's no doubt that the outgoing commission was as green as it could be. I think on the list, on the 10 priority list, the green transition was number one. I don't know where it is now. I don't know if it is in the list at all.
Oh, well, Kurt can tell us. Where is it now?
This is, for example, Mrs. von der Leyen, when she announced that she will seek another term. I don't think she mentioned green transition in the first 3 or 5 priorities. Why is that? Because the outgoing commission, and of course the president, have realized that the outgoing commission has not been industry friendly or business friendly. Has, as I said back in 2021, I was probably one of the first people to say in public, it is wrong to assume that the industry is against green transition and in favor of staying where we are now. But what we have said over and over again is that we need a transition, like you say, which is very firm. It has the resources to be supported. It has the support of the public opinion. Because what happened 5 years ago, 2019, we go to the people in the Euro election and we say, are you in favor of the green transition? That was the question. And a lot of people said, yes, we are. But that question was incomplete. The complete question should have been, are you in favor of the green transition, knowing that it will cost you 30% of your income for the next 20 years? And then maybe there will be a different answer.
20%? Or
20% or 10% or 30%, whatever. I don't know about the cost of the green transition, but they are huge. So that was not the complete question. And the industry was a victim of this. As Kurt said, it has been neglected by our Outgoing Commission, and we hope, because at the moment, from what I see, from the program of the main parties, including the PPP, we see number one goal, defense, which is now coming from nowhere. It's coming to the top of the priorities. And number two, industrial competitiveness. Why? Because Europe is losing market share everywhere, and it's losing competitiveness. And it's not right, that's why I will disagree a little bit with Kurt. It's not right to say, okay, c'est la vie, we will stay the course, not much to be done, but in 10 years, everything will be all right. There will be battery storage, there will be hydrogen, and so on. But in 10 years, there will be no industry left. Much earlier than 10 years.
Well,
so we have to, excuse me,
yep.
last minute. We have to combine the green transition the decarbonization of the economy with a healthy industry, because without industry, Europe is going to go even further down on the competitiveness of the global scale.
Okay, so, I mean, you know, the Commission has, or the EU has introduced a lot of policies that are supposed to make life easier for industry, including things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism that Jos mentioned at the start of the conversation. I think actually your firm's been quite critical of that because you haven't seen it working as well as you think it should. Is that still the case?
You mean the way the outgoing Commission has worked on the industry?
Sorry, the carbon border tax, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I mean, there have been policies that have been introduced in response to industry concerns, but I guess you're saying that there needs to be more.
We have expressed our reservations to the President of the Commission, also to Mr. Šefčovič and others, about the effectiveness of the CBAM. I have Chinese friends who are also aluminum producers like ours, and they are laughing at the CBAM because they have 10 factories each. One or two of the factories, they produce aluminum with hydro energy, which is 100% green, and they say, this is what we're going to send to Europe. The other 8 factories we are going to send to the world. No problem.
But for your company, if you're in,
thank you very much.
If you're producing aluminium in Greece, isn't it still good to have a policy like the CBAM to protect you against less green imports?
It will not solve the problem because the incoming products will be carbon-free. But the rest of the production of Chinese or others, it will not be carbon-free.
Right.
So we shut down our European factories, which used to be the best, most effective on the carbon side as well. And this production, aluminum production, is being done in China in much worse terms, with almost 80 or 90% coal energy. So what do? As you said, the problem, the climatic problem, is a global problem. It's not a European problem. If we do not use diplomacy to convince other people, nations, continents, to follow the European example, where do we stand?
Well, let me attack.
Take time, though.
Let me ask another question about China that's very much in the news. We finally have a situation where the Chinese car industry has managed to figure out a way to make an electric car that can sell for less than 20,000 euros, brand new, which you might think is a great thing for the climate. However, in the United States, and perhaps in Europe, we're going to see these tariffs introduced that are going to make it pretty much impossible to buy directly from China, might make it easier for China to set up manufacturing in the EU or the US, but nonetheless, we're seeing these tariffs being erected. I just wonder, how do you all feel about the fact that we've finally reached a point in the energy transition where we've got this terrific green technology and countries that are at the forefront, really, of green energy policy, climate policy, are erecting trade barriers? Kurt,
excuse me for 1 minute. In the solar industry, where we are very active, 90% or more of our purchases of solar panels for the 40 countries of the world that we are active, they're Chinese, and they're extremely cheap. What happened to the solar industry and the panels is now going to happen with the cars, because the Chinese supply chain is subsidized all the way. And what happened? The European solar industry does not exist anymore, even the American. And the Chinese are going to do the same with batteries for cars, and the cars, as you said, are going to be very cheap and extremely competitive.
Yeah, yeah.
what I think you're right, but that's a strategic industrial policy that Kurt, in my view, was referring to. Okay, we lost the battle of the first wave of solar panel. I think that's done. But so that's why this problem of investment and industrial policy is so crucial. Because again, I'm not in the government now, so I would say good if there is an oversupply of solar panel, take it now, or at least encourage China to export to other countries who need them. But then we have to prepare the second, the new generation, because, okay, we have lost the battle on the actual ones. So what is the next generation of the solar panel? As this, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has designed where we still have a capacity to rule the market, or at least to enter the market on the green transition. And I think that's why the investment issue should be, of course, targeted. Then, on top of that, the Green Deal was not, at that stage, an industrial policy. That was not the discussion. Even if on digital we were beginning to have one, but not on the green transition. And I do think that will make the change. And in particular, looking at the technology who are ahead of the curve and where we need the innovation investment.
Okay, I quickly want to react. This would require a lot more discussion, but first I would like to say, let's not be the economy of Smith Corona. I don't know if people remember this, but Smith Corona was a typewriter that was perfected by a company in the 1980s. They thought they had the sublime, ideal typewriter, and then the internet came and the computer, and everything was wiped out in 2-3 years. So at a time when the whole world is moving into the clean space, the renewable space, we cannot afford to get stuck in a fossil-based economy. We need to realize that China is moving very fast. 58% of all added renewable energy capacity last year was in China alone, 17% in Europe. Is the answer then to say, stop, we don't want this, we'll close our borders? No, to the contrary. And I agree with Laurence, the thing is not that we now need to restart producing solar panels. We need to look at the next generation of clean technologies, where we have clearly said now, in agreement, in law, that 40% of clean tech manufacturing in Europe has to be done within Europe. We are very open to competition globally. This will help the global climate, but we want this competition to be fair. And when we see that our trading partners are not playing fair, then we will act. That's why we are investigating subsidies from China on electric vehicles. I don't think that Europe has an interest in becoming a made in Europe economic framework, but we are working very hard on resilience criteria to make sure that at least the emerging new clean tech sectors in Europe get a foothold and can grow and scale up in Europe and conquer international markets as well.
Okay, great, fantastic. Thank you so much. Now, we have time for a couple of questions. If anybody has a burning question in the audience, please raise your hands. My colleagues have microphones. There's a gentleman in the third row back there. I can see. We'll take one more as well. If anyone, can I see any other hands? No, sir, you have the floor.
Yes,
if you could identify yourself to begin with, that'd be terrific.
Yes, sure. My name is Christian Singleson, and I head the EU's energy regulatory agency called ACER. I have a question from the industry representative in particular. We have a gas disadvantage vis-a-vis North America at a factor of 3 to 5 in terms of energy input price. It's very difficult to see parts of the world where new coal generation is price competitive to renewable generation. That speaks to cheaper energy for Europe being a function of those advantages that we do have, which I would say is one, that we reap relative renewable resource endowments across the continent, and second, we make our energy system massively more efficient, primarily via digitalization. What I wanted to ask for the industry representative is, given that energy-intensive industry has some disadvantages to other continents, is it not in your industry's interest to be able to import cheaper energy production facilities as opposed to having more expensive solar or more expensive wind generation, which inevitably will drive up costs for energy also for your industry. So is there not also, let's say, an openness versus protectionism theme for your industry simply by virtue of competitiveness terms? Thank you.
So when you say import energy production,
I mean the production facilities to generate energy, a solar PV facility, a wind turbine, etc. If they become 30% more expensive by virtue of taxation borders that we have, that will translate into higher energy input prices for your industry as well. Thank you.
Evangelos, that's a question for you. Does it make more sense?
I'm not sure I understood well because of the echo. What is the question?
Well, I think the question is basically, does it not make more sense for companies inside the EU to try to import cheaper energy production equipment rather than relying on purchasing inside the EU? Is that roughly correct? Sorry. We've got a bit of a slight echo.
If we accept that we will remain for geological reasons at a price disadvantage in gas vis-a-vis North America, I think that's a geological fact because of the shale gas endowment in North America. And if we accept that coal generation is very difficult to see being price competitive vis-a-vis renewables, then energy-intensive industry in Europe will need to rely on renewables to a significant extent, and it needs to be as cheap as possible. One way to make that cheaper is to rely on resource endowments across Europe, wind in the south, wind in the north, solar in the south, as one popularly says, but also that the equipment which generates that renewable energy is cheaper than it would otherwise be.
Okay, so basically, why don't you rely more on home-generated wind and solar, which can be done very cheaply, because that would be competitively an advantage for industry? I think that sums it up.
Europe has, outside Norway, Europe has no fossil fuel sources anyway. But it has sun, especially in the south, and it has wind, especially in the north. And it has very much sun and very much wind. And this power that is produced by sun and wind can be more than sufficient to replace gas or other fossil fuels. The problem is, as I said before, that we have made the generation parks, solar or otherwise, first, and then we realize that we do not have the grid to transmit this energy to all the consumers, especially to the heavy industry. In our smelter, which is a massive consumer of energy, we have already spent hundreds of millions of euros in order to replace lignite 100% with renewables at 20 to 30%, and gas. Now we gradually have to replace the gas as well. That will take time and it will take money. What I said to Kurt before is the industry to succeed through this transitional period needs the support of the Commission. And what I said as a complaint, I'm sorry, is the outgoing Commission was not industry friendly. They never heard our problems, and we celebrate the fact that we consume 15% less gas or 20% less than before. Yes, but what is the price for it? It's much less industrial production. Are we happy with this? Is it the solution? Then let's abolish gas. Gas is a transition fuel. We have to accept this. There's no replacement for gas at the moment. How quickly we get rid of gas? It's up to people like Kurt. It's not for me to decide.
Okay, Kurt, can you, in 30 seconds, quickly respond to that?
Well, 30 seconds. I think what we see is an industrial transformation in Europe, which the map of industry in Europe will be redrawn in function of energy endowments. Because the energy endowments in the future are different from the past. And I think what we can do is gain a lot in cost efficiency if we better use the single market. Think tanks have demonstrated that simply by integrating the electricity market in Europe, we save 20% of costs, simply by better integrating across borders. If we profit from the solar in the south, rather than investing in producing green hydrogen in Germany, for example, it becomes much more cost efficient. But then we need to make sure that there are interconnectors between the south, the north, and industrial heartlands that we have. Again, single market. We are very convinced we need a lot more grids investment. We have come with a grid action plan. Actually, the EIB will invest massively in this now. But I think I would go even a step further, and then, which was the focus of this session. We do not need to look only within the 27 EU member states. We need to look at the broader neighborhood.
Yeah.
Just one last point on this, if I may. Solar panels are 3 times more efficient in North Africa than in Europe.
Yeah.
And last year, there was 500 gigawatt renewable energy added to the world's system. A first ever. It's growing every year. But only 5% was in Africa. This is what we need to change. And we need to bring Northern Africa and our neighborhood into our wider perspective of an industrial policy, which is allowing us, enabling us to stay the course on this transition. But cost efficiency is really the name of the game from now on.
Yeah, great points. And I'm just going to ask Jos to do the very difficult thing now of trying to sum up this terrific discussion. Thank you all very much. But Jos, can you just finish off by telling us your thoughts on how you would sum up the points that have been raised?
Well, this is a fascinating discussion that is going to take place in the coming election debate and afterwards, so very important. But 3 points I would like to highlight out of the debate. First is the transformation triggered by the Green Deal is much more comprehensive and wide-ranging compared to what we see as of today. And we see that in social aspects, we see that in the need for investments, a massive need for investments, but it's not going to be a walk in the park. And that is coming out of the discussion that we have been having. The second point I take from the discussion is that competitiveness of European industry is at the heart of the problem. And at the inner heart of that problem is the cost of energy and the way we regulate energy. And I'm very pleased to say that in this town and at the European University Institute, a lot of attention is going to that question. It's not only about renewables, it's also about investments in grids, in batteries. So the entire energy system is about to change because we have to move away from fossil fuels. That's, it can be, gas can be a transition fuel, but it's not the solution to the problem. So we have to keep that very much in the back of our mind. And the third point that I take out of the discussion is that we need another form of cooperation with the world. We need to reevaluate our different partners now that we have lost Russia and the raw materials and energy imports from Russia. There are new opportunities arising in the Mediterranean, a lot of sun, a lot of wind, so there are new partnerships coming. And I think that it was indicated that we started with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but that the problem at hand goes way beyond that. We have to rethink our geopolitical relations with the world. And I think that was coming out of this debate. It's much more comprehensive. The cost of energy and energy regulation matters much more, and the way with whom we are going to cooperate in the world needs a fundamental rethink. And we may use other words in the next European policy cycle. We may use the words green less, but if we use the words more investments in decarbonized equipment, then we are going to reach the same result. Thank you.
Great way to end. Please thank our excellent panelists. Great discussion.
Very nice conversation.
Mic. Hello. I need a microphone. 1 sec. There you go. I need a microphone.
So good evening and welcome to the very last panel of the State of the Union for 2024. My name is Eric Jones and I'm director of the Robert Schuman Center. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here into the Salone dei 500. I know you've been here for quite some time already. What we want to do this evening is talk a bit about the vision for the future of Europe. And in talking about that vision, we're going to draw upon a report that is the first report that's been produced by a group that calls itself the Conclave, and the report is entitled Europe 2040, Tomorrow is Today. Now there were at least 10 authors on that report, but we're very fortunate to be joined by one of them, Loukas Tsoukalis, who was the author of the geopolitical part of the report. So we're going to focus a bit on that. But before I hand over to Loukas, I'd like to introduce you to all of our panelists, and then we'll bring them in an order that's determined by the first letter of their last name. Now, Loukas Tsoukalis is Emeritus Professor at the University of Athens and President of the Board of ELIAMEP, which is the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. After Loukas speaks, I'll introduce you to Nadia Koval, who's the head of Information and Analytics Department of the Ukrainian Institute, and she's also a lecturer at the Kyiv School of Economics. After Nadia speaks, Andrew Moravchik will take over. He's professor and director of both the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination and the European Union program at Princeton University. Our own George Papakonstantinou will follow. George, as you know, is acting director of the School of Transnational Governance and Dean of Education, Executive Education at the European University Institute. And then finally, we'll be joined by Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's Chief Executive Officer of New America in the United States and a contributing editor to the Financial Times. Now, what I've asked is for Loukas to speak for about 10 minutes on the report, and then I'll draw the other participants in with questions and give them 4 or 5 minutes of conversation, and then we'll try to bring you in so that we have the chance to benefit from your questions and insights as well. But to start, Loukas, could I invite you up to the podium to begin the conversation? Thank you.
If I manage to get my papers right. Okay. Thank you very much for this kind invitation to the State of the Union Conference. It is a pleasure and indeed an honor to speak in this majestic hall to a distinguished audience. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you, drawing mainly on the report of the Conclave, which Eric Jones has already mentioned, and of which I'm a co-author. I propose to concentrate here today on the geopolitical dimension. First of all, a few words about how much the world has changed and what it means for us Europeans. As we know, European integration accelerated much after the end of the Cold War, going hand in hand with market-driven globalization. And many people in Brussels and elsewhere held an image of the world with multilateral institutions, strong common rules, and growing interdependence. A world in which European open economies would benefit a great deal from which, and also a world in which Europe could exert its so-called soft power. That was the stuff that Brussels' dreams were made of back then. Often unspoken, there was also the assumption that if things were to turn bad, Europe could always rely on the United States as her protector of last resort. Such dreams are now turning into a nightmare. War is back, close to our borders. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the post-Cold War order, as admittedly shaped by those who won the Cold War, is now dead and buried. And that's not all. The geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting violently, and the unipolar moment of US undisputed hegemony is being followed by growing strategic rivalry between the United States and China. New emerging powers are also jostling for vital space. It will be more like a multipolar world than a bipolar one, in which the US most likely will remain for years to come more than primus inter pares, yet increasingly constrained and hence frustrated. Furthermore, with an extremely polarized political system and a very unequal society, the fundamentals of US foreign policy can no longer be taken for granted. Meanwhile, economic interdependence is being weaponized and security considerations take over from the logic of economic efficiency. Europeans were surely not prepared for such a world, and they have been making frantic efforts to adjust. But let us be clear, adjustment requires nothing less than the reprogramming of European DNA, collective DNA, which is a hard thing to do. In the short time, therefore, I have available today, I shall attempt to highlight some of the key challenges, what I believe to be key challenges facing us Europeans. The first and most difficult challenge, it seems to me, and Josep Borrell was saying exactly the same in an earlier session, is to essentially add a security dimension to what has been for decades a peace project. I mean, of course, European integration as a project of peace and reconciliation on a continent with a long history of wars, which we often had the bad habit of exporting to the rest of the world. Our internal peace project has worked remarkably well, but it is no longer enough. We now need to take collective responsibility for our defense by gradually creating a European defense pillar as part of the Atlantic Alliance. This should in turn lead to a more symmetrical distribution of burdens and responsibilities between the two sides of the Atlantic. It would require increased defense expenditures, which is hardly a popular thing, closer cooperation between national armies, joint procurement, and a stronger multinational European defense industry. Easier said than done, I'm sure many of you will be tempted to add. In a threatening world, with a revisionist, revanchist Russia on their border and a highly unstable neighborhood to the east and the south, Europeans will need to take greater responsibility for their defense, while at the same time try to exert a moderating influence in global affairs. We know that European construction has been built on continuous dialogue and compromise. This is a legacy worth trying to export to an unstable world in transition, without, however, forgetting the limitations of soft power. European Venus, if I may say so, cannot rely only on her beauty and charm. She will need to carry a hard stick when dealing with bullies, of which there are many around. And we surely can't do it as individual European countries, because even former great powers of Europe no longer count for much in a highly asymmetrical world. Let me now move on to trade. Compared with the United States, Europe has much more open economies, or economy, given our single market. If in doubt, look at the figures on exports and imports as a percentage of GDP on the two sides of the Atlantic. The conclusion to draw is that Europe simply cannot afford to build protectionist walls and retreat behind them. The difference between de-risking, which is the European term, and decoupling, which is the American term, in economic relations with China is not just a matter of words. It is a real one that can make the Atlantic much wider. On the other hand, Europe cannot limit herself to the role of a frustrated referee through the exercise of regulatory powers in the technological race between American and Chinese high-tech companies. We need to become part of the game. Again, easier said than done. Otherwise, our prosperity will be compromised while our security, democracy, and individual rights will be hostages to decisions taken beyond our borders. It is in Europe's interest to have multilateral institutions and rules to govern interdependence. A renewed multilateralism should allow both for a bigger share of emerging powers in global governance, while at the same time trying to make sure there's not much room for free riding, of which there's been too much. We need global cooperation to preserve peace and contribute to prosperity. We also need global cooperation to provide global public goods, notably a livable planet, at a time when climate change constitutes an existential challenge for us all. Now I move to a different and perhaps even more difficult subject. With an aging and shrinking population, we shall need a steady influx of immigrants in Europe. But we shall also have to address head-on growing resistance in our societies and the populist threat. Migration flows need to be regulated, while the external supply of migrants will continue to rise. And there's no point in pretending there can be easy solutions, especially in times when leadership is in short supply and the ephemeral rules our domestic politics. My last point, the challenge of further enlargement. The invasion of Ukraine and Russia's threat has pushed enlargement to the top of the European political agenda. It is all about exporting Pax Europei, meaning peace, democracy and prosperity, to less fortunate parts of the continent. We know from experience that enlargement has been the most successful foreign policy of the European Union. Admittedly, one success among very few. And we also know from experience that enlargement cannot be the magic potion that cures all ills. If in doubt, look around at the EU of 27 today. Some applicants have been waiting for years with precious little progress on their accession negotiations. The EU pretends to negotiate and they pretend to reform, and nothing happens. Now we need to accelerate the process with even more candidates, including Ukraine, while also making sure that the enlarged EU does not become a model of dysfunctionality. And this is a crucial point. The recipe for a successful enlargement, I believe, lies in the combination of reforms on the side of the EU and the candidate countries, coupled with phased integration of aspiring new members and more differentiation inside the enlarged EU. Sure, it will be messier than it already is today. But can we think of realistic alternatives that do not put off further enlargement forever and/or destroy the EU? I've been asked to offer a vision for the future of Europe in 10 minutes. That's all I could do, so I look forward now to comments and criticism from my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Well, Loukas, it's hard to criticize you when you actually fit it all in 10 minutes. So, Nadia, I wonder if you could help us, because Loukas left us on a major challenge associated with enlargement, and enlargement of the EU involves change both in the countries and in the European Union itself. But it seems as though there's a prerequisite for this enlargement that's been left out of the occasion, which is finding some way to win the war that's being fought in your country today. So can you give us some insights into both the war in Ukraine and its impact on this vision of a future Europe and the enlargement process that should necessarily follow?
Yes, actually, exactly. I would like to continue what Professor Tsoukalis started, mentioning the huge institutional challenges for the European Union in the enlargement process. But my point would be that we should also very clearly link this future enlargement process with the war, with actually winning a war. Because my point would be that we would be unable to conduct credible enlargement for further 10 states of the European Union if this war is not won. The problem is that enlargement, Eastern enlargement, and Russian relations, relations of European Union and Russia, have been connected actually for most 20, 30 years. And the previous policy in this respect was relying on developing economic and energy interdependencies with Russia and following so-called partnership for modernization and engaging Russia in European policy, while leaving a certain gray zone in the Eastern post-Soviet countries, with the hope actually not to provoke Russia and actually denying these countries the actual possibility of membership in the European Union. And what happened on the February 22, 2022, this policy, it actually crumbled. It turned out that Russian revisionism could not be held by these constructive measures, and we actually are now in the situation where we need to find a new strategy. And what is actually important is that previously the strategy that I have described, promoted and conceived by France and Germany, it doesn't work anymore, and France and Germany now, as the leaders of European foreign policy, as the leaders of formulating Eastern European policy, they are not in agreement on what should be done in relation to Russia, what should be done in relation to war and in Ukraine. So there is a huge need of strategic rethinking, and rethinking the whole process in the terms of victory in the war. Because victory in the war, enlargement, more cohesive union, bigger union, more effective union, a union which has credible security dimension, is a vision which is possible only when this Russian attempt at international law and European security is held back. So the problem here and the challenge here is to create this strategy of victory and not to substitute it with an alternative idea which is actually currently getting traction either more or less openly. The idea of so-called negotiated settlement or compromises, which actually amounts to territorial partition of Ukraine as with the hope to somehow outweigh the problem and see what happens later. I think this solution is not viable. It will not bring down the Russian expansionism. It will make further enlargement, especially in the eastern periphery, impossible. Let's remember how the 2014, how the war actually started, starting not with any NATO-related issue, but with the issue of the association agreement of Ukraine and the European Union. So this is what I would actually turn my attention to, and I hope we will win the war and build together a wonderful European Union of the future.
No, thank you so much, Nadia. I think this laser-like focus on winning the war is hugely important, not just because I agree with you that we need to win the war, but because it contrasts so sharply with the efforts that were made in decades prior to achieve many different goals at the same time. And it seems as though what we lacked in that period was a sense of prioritization, because we were trying to do so many things at once that we lost sight of what was important in the choices that we needed to make. We lost sight of this strategic focus. So Andy, if I could bring you in at this point, what are the values that we should be trying to maximize here? What are the choices that we need to make? And what are the priorities that we need to set looking ahead to this future? Because one of the things that impressed me from the Conclave report were the 17 different areas of activity, but it also depressed me because I wasn't quite sure how to boil it down in the way that Nadia did so effectively.
So I think all of you ask when you see another report on the future of Europe or the vision for Europe, should I read this report? And I think the answer lies in whether or not you can boil down the 17 proposals to something that we can really work with. And I think there are three reasons why this is a good place to start. The first is that I think we all, or everybody in this room, agrees with the basic premise, which is a rather idealistic premise, which is that the Europe as a continent and the European project are worthy of being sustained and promoted. I speak now as an American citizen, but I think objectively, if you look at the world, there are few regions that have come anywhere close to the same defensible balance of social solidarity, democracy, peace, efficiency, all these virtues as Europe has. And most Europeans want to promote that further. In fact, as an American, I feel I have an investment in that because, for example, my digital rights as an American are mostly due to European law, not to American law. Europe can be a force for good in the world in the 21st century, and we should hope that it is successful. And the question is how. And that brings us to these 17 points. Because turning ideals into reality is a pragmatic task. And a pragmatic task means that one needs to boil down these 17 tasks into something that we can work with. Sustainability, economic efficiency, strong defense, a green economy, and 14 more are a lot. Now, this report is good to read because it lays out a very clear vision of what would be necessary in each of these 17 areas. What it doesn't do is ask, how should we prioritize? And pragmatic action is, by its very necessity, a process of prioritization, of deciding what is more important to emphasize, particularly in the long run, in the most fundamental long run. And I think if you read this report, and I really encourage you to do it, you would come to the conclusion that there is a subtext or perhaps a logic underlying all these 17 projects that prioritizes one of them. And that one is the economic well-being of Europe. Everything that Professor Tsoukalis talked about, having a strong defense, attracting other countries through enlargement, negotiating in a world where Europe does not want to be subject to the diktat of Beijing or Washington in trade negotiations, dealing with a world that will be moving toward AI faster than any of us could have imagined, and defining a space in which European rules, not American or Chinese rules, guide policy here. All that presupposes that the European economy is functioning in a productive, efficient, and growth-oriented manner. And so I would submit that that is where Europe, in the longer term, really needs to focus its efforts. And like any pragmatic project, that has two implications. The first is there will be very difficult priorities to decide. Professor Tsoukalis mentioned one of them, what to do about migration. Politically difficult, but economically necessary. How to handle various new technologies, which to promote, which not to promote, and so on down the line. That should be the focus, I think, or the foundation of a grand strategy that could then bring us to issues like what can be done in the long term to build a more strong and cohesive European defense. That question, which to prioritize, is not answered in this report. It's rarely answered in reports that are put together by a committee of people that have different priorities and interests and areas of expertise. That decision is for you, for European citizens, European experts, Europeans to decide. And so the most important reason to read this report is you will be making this decision whether you like it or not, and you might as well do it in an informed fashion.
Well, thank you, Andy. If I could extract a bit from both your and Nadia's conversation, in the short run, we have to win this war in Ukraine. In the intermediate run, we have to go through this very challenging process of enlargement, and in the long run, we need to figure out what are the economic priorities for Europe. And I guess the question that I have when I look at that is, even if we structure it in this kind of more tractable to explain sort of way, I'm not quite clear how we do all of that at the same time. So, George, can you give us a sense of where we get the resources for this? What are the economic preconditions that we need to have in Europe or to bring into place in Europe in order to make this multiple staged set of issues tractable?
So when Eric invited me to this panel, I asked him, what should I say? He said, you know, you're the economist, be the reality check. So let me try and do that. Because I think we can all agree about some of the short-term goals, and I think they were very well elaborated. And we can all agree that our medium-term goal is a combination of maintaining what we have as a social model, being globally competitive and having a place in the world. But to do all of this, there are preconditions, and they are hard. And I would suggest that there are four main preconditions. I'm trying to boil them down so I can have 60 seconds on each of these four. I'll first enumerate them, and then I'll use my 60 seconds on each. Currency, budget, industry, and an army. So these are the combination of soft and hard power that allow Europe to have a place in the world, but also develop internally, become more cohesive, etc. Let me take each of these. Currency. Yes, we have the euro. It has been established miraculously over the last 20 odd years, 25. It is solidly the second most used currency in the world. But it is vulnerable in two ways. One, whenever there is a crisis, everyone flocks to the dollar. The dollar is the solid refuge. And the more multipolar the world becomes, the weaker the euro becomes in this multipolarity. Look at the unintended consequence of the sanctions that we collectively imposed. We have weaponized the global financial system. Which of the Western currencies is going to suffer out of this? It's not going to be the dollar, it is going to be the euro. Does that mean that we should not have sanctions? Of course not. But we need to carry through with the kind of reforms that we need to use our currency and make it stronger in the world, internally completing our monetary union and externally projecting the currency that we have built. Number two, budget. Do we have a European budget? No, we do not. We have a budget that caps at 1% of European GDP. This is laughably small. We are in a situation where if you look at debt to GDP ratios throughout the Eurozone and the EU, they are much higher than they were before the global financial crisis, before the Eurozone crisis. So most countries don't have space to move. In that situation, the only space is European space. And yet we are afraid of taking the one-off that we have used for COVID, the Next Generation EU, and the financing instruments and making them to more permanent elements and attaching to these revenues that are collected at the European level. Three, industry. Already Andrew mentioned this. We are simultaneously losing our old industries and losing the battle for the new industries, which are around clean tech, data, AI. We are nowhere in this field. We are good regulators, but we're terrible innovators. With very few exceptions, we do not manage to build this new, and that requires money. It goes back to the first two elements. And finally, I don't know of any global power that is not able to project military strength along its soft power. And it is kind of an irony that the only way that we can generate some kind of European agreement, potentially on a new European financing mechanism, is around defense. And we couldn't do it around green transition, we couldn't do it around digital transition, we can maybe do it around defense, and then if we get lucky, we'll add some things to defense and hopefully be able to further some of our other goals. So these are some hard preconditions. If we don't take this seriously, I'm afraid that the vision for Europe is going to be excellent reports with lack of implementation.
Okay, so I'm listening across these different presentations, and it sounds like we're actually moving toward a new paradigm for understanding the European project, one that's in many ways different from the paradigm that existed before. Anne-Marie, perhaps you could help us understand what this new paradigm might look like in terms of its relationship to technology, its relationship to power, and its relation to global multilateral institutions, because these are the things that seem to be the building blocks for this Europe of the future. I'm just not sure how they're assembled.
Thank you. So the first thing to say is you've heard calls for radical change. High Representative Borrell said Europe needs a new software. Professor Tsoukalis flipped to the life sciences and said Europe needs new DNA. But those are both big changes. And they are changes in a very different direction than the original European project. And you heard High Representative Borrell also say Europe was born to build peace and a common economy between its states and to build a kind of multilateral rule of law world. There's an astonishing amount of agreement here. I'm going to follow directly on George's points. What struck me the most, as an American, but as a half Belgian American who deeply believes in the European project, what struck me was the claim that Europe needs or should undertake, it's a recommendation, its own Copernican revolution, that it no longer wants to be tossed between the United States and China. It's mixing metaphors there, but bear with me. So if you think of what does that mean, a Copernican revolution? What it's saying is Europe has to stop orbiting around the United States and China and the other great powers of the world, and instead Europe has to have its own power and be comfortable with that power, not just civilian power, not just soft power, but hard power, economic power and military power, so that it can actually set its own course. You heard it before, closer to the United States, always, I certainly hope, although that might be more up to the United States and where we go, than China or Russia or Iran or India or Brazil, many other powers, but Europe really does have to set that course. It can't do that without its own strong military power, whether that's one European army, or I think you heard different common European defense and military capacity within NATO. I think that's probably more in the way the report went. So, but to build that defense capacity, yes, you need money, yes, you need industry, but you cannot build that capacity without your own technological capacity. But again, Europe is the world's greatest regulatory power. It is the great regulator of technology, but it does not have that technology. And it is never going to have the power that it needs unless you develop your own technological base. So I thought the best part of this report was that it recognized that, and it actually said, okay, we missed the boat on the first round of digital platforms. That's the Americans and the Chinese. But now you have a chance with both AI and quantum to actually move ahead, to have a European technological model that A, will help you regulate, but B, the world needs competition to the American Silicon Valley model and the Chinese government model. One very public, but very authoritarian, one very, very private. And that model, and the report goes on to talk about that model, is in fact for government to build the basic technological infrastructure, supercomputing for quantum computers, the basic language models or other models that you're going to need for AI. So the government builds the platforms, and then European industry, medium-sized, even small industry, builds on top of that. A new model of the way you can do technology. The US model is huge platforms who invest in smaller companies, but only to then swallow them. And this model is, no, the government puts in that basic tech infrastructure, and on top of it, you can have a thriving European industry. You're going to have to do that for a military capacity anyway. The United States built the internet because of DARPA. It's not the Advanced Research Projects Agency, it's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. I have never thought that I would sit up here and argue for European military power. This is not what I've spent my life writing about. But honestly, Monica, you said it. We do have to win this war. There does have to be European military capacity. I cannot promise you that my country will be there with its army beyond November. I wish I could, but I can't. Even if we can, and Loukas, you started here as well, Europe's got to be able to defend itself, to push back, and to build its own power so that it can actually not only articulate its ideals, but achieve them in a very complicated world. So I would definitely read this report. I'm going to be telling my friends in the United States to read this report. And above all, I think the world does need this new technological model, and Europe can achieve it.
So it seems like we've pulled together the elements of a vision, right? A Europe that has its own ability to project force, to win the war in Ukraine, but also its own ability to be inclusive, to bring Ukraine and those other candidate countries into the European Union. This is not something that's going to be easy. It's going to involve significant reforms on all sides, but it is something that's going to result both in greater prosperity and in greater security, and those two things seem to be hand in hand. Greater prosperity, greater security, and greater independence. Because at the bottom line, Europeans need to have their own values, priorities, and to take responsibility for the choices that define them. I think this is a very compelling vision of Europe, but I'd be curious to know what you and the audience think. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. They're going to try to cut me off at some point, but I'll try to hold on as long as I can. If you could raise your hands and somebody could lower these lights. Right there in the third row, there's a woman with her hand up.
Yes. I'm suggesting instead of thinking only of waging war, also of waging peace in Europe, especially through housing, because with the migration problem in Ireland, there's a great deal of stress now because of the lack of housing, and it is causing racism which didn't exist before. And also in Ukraine, we need to be rebuilding a country that is devastated. And we have in Florence the model of Giorgio Lapira's Isolotto. I'm thinking of garden cities where the children of migrants and natives play together and so unlearn to be racist, which is the cause of war.
Yeah, hi, thank you for the very interesting discussion. I'm Max from Europe Calling, and I wanted to ask the question, what role do citizens actually play in your future of Europe? I think you've never mentioned the word citizens once, and I really want to know what you think about their involvement in the future of the Union.
Thank you very much for this compelling discussion. It's been extremely inspiring, and I would like to keep on the same topic of citizenship and bring you this question, which is also an affirmation from my deep heart. I think European citizens are ready for Europe to be our nation. I feel European. I don't feel just Italian. I think we are made slow and not brave enough by our governments, by the people that represent us. The citizens of Europe are ready to feel as such, deeply. We are the people that can build Europe a lot better than the people that represent us today. This is why it's so important that we all go to vote.
Okay, I'll take one more question and then bring it back to the panel. I can see someone here in the front row.
Well, I just wondered on the question of prosperity and defence. If the individual European countries cannot meet the 2% contribution to NATO, their GDPs, varying, only a few of them have actually made that or crossed that barrier, if you like. I really wonder what hope there is of a common defence or army within the EU. If you haven't done it by now, and it's 2 years since the invasion of Ukraine, when will it happen?
Okay, we have four very challenging questions about peace, about democracy, about identity, and about the political will to bring all these things into being. I suggest that we go in reverse order, if that would be okay. Emery, would you like to start?
Yes, I get to choose the easier ones. And so on this last question, two things. One, the EU does move slowly, but it has made commitments, certainly in Germany and the Eastern countries. But I would also say a lot of what blocks a real European defense capacity on the military side is less money than bureaucracy and continued nationalism. There is no one common market in arms, or for that matter in technology. When I talk to the business leaders, it is much more that you're really still 27 relatively small markets to develop that. So I'm not saying that spending more money doesn't matter, but that's not necessarily the place to start. On the first point, the other thing that I loved about this report, and it's completely different, is that it actually says that Europe should make, I think I'm quoting, a massive investment in care activities. I write about care a great deal. I've pushed for developing an infrastructure of care in the United States. I think that is right. I agree you're going to have to make some choices. You can't have all the guns and all the butter. I will say that building up a defense capacity generally gets economies going. It's certainly done that in the United States. It's doing that in Russia now. I think it's critical to recognize that you will only get the continued support of European citizens for this project if you are also addressing social issues in a smart way, and probably also a new way informed in part by new technologies.
George?
First of all, we're finding, I'll try to answer, sort of combine the questions somehow, which is not going to be easy. We're finding ourselves in this very strange situation, all of us kind of arguing for more defense, bigger military presence. I think of myself a few years back and saying the kind of things that we're saying now, and I'm kind of shocked. I don't think that at the moment there is a sharp contrast between guns and butters in the way that we would normally put it. I think you can pursue both at the same time. But I want to go to more to the question on participation of citizens, because yes, none of us actually mentioned the word. But why is it that we have not advanced on these various issues that we mentioned? Why do we not have the kind of a capital markets union which would allow industry to leverage funding and be more innovative? Why do we not have a stronger common currency? Why do we not have agreement on a bigger European budget? Because our national governments block this. And because they do not feel that citizens are there. Now, here's the real question. Is this a mirage or is this a reality? And there's a number of interesting studies out there that show that people are actually more willing to go to European solutions for funding stuff rather than indebting their own country. Now, that doesn't mean that they want to throw it on Europe, but it does mean that this idea of a European identity is being developed. Until and unless we work more on that, we will not be able to convince governments to move on what are at the moment immovable national lines, because that's what stops progress. It is that every national government is elected on the basis of national goals, and Europe is fairly down the agenda. Think of European elections at the moment. Go to any one of our countries. How much is the European agenda part of the discussion? I can tell you that in my country, and I'm sure it's not atypical, all we talk about is domestic politics. We don't really talk about the European conversation. That's a major failure. It's a failure of governments, it's a failure of political elites, and it's a failure perhaps of the participation methods that we have. So we need to reinvent it somehow and be able to then push from the bottom to get movement at the top.
Thank you, George. Andy?
I hate to be the person that breaks the consensus, but I mean, I guess I disagree a little with the trend of this. The first is that I think the central role is played by citizens, and it is already. I think citizens are setting the priority that governments are following in the European Union, and citizens have to change the setting of priorities if we want Europe to be different than it is. I certainly would subscribe to the view that that starts with voting for certain people for the European Parliament, more importantly actually for the national Parliament. But there's a danger in the view that we should maximize the influence of those citizens. Europe went down that road for about a decade with a large constitutional debate about these kind of absolutes, and it tended to show what I think most people in my profession, I'm a political scientist, think is generally true about publics, which is throwing an issue in an unstructured way to a mass public generally doesn't create an orderly or moderate solution. So I think it is a project. But I don't think just democratizing at the European level would help us. The other place where I differ is on defense. I think defense is one of the things that Europe might spend more money on were it to become more productive and really open up a debate to how it should promote its place in the world. But I'm with Anne-Marie that much can be done without spending another euro. And the kind of defense spending that Europe wants to do won't necessarily generate a military power, anything like the United States that can kind of land helicopters and drones anywhere in the world. So I think some serious thought needs to be done, not just about the possibilities of European defense spending, but the rational and sensible limits to that as a priority for Europe.
Super. Thank you, Andy. Nadia?
I will probably return to the first question that was posed, the idea of a waging peace. Actually, you can't wage peace if you can't defend yourself. And you can't rebuild the country while it is still being attacked. I will give you an example. In the winter of 2022-23, Russians tried for the first time to make a full blackout of Ukraine. So they were targeting with their missiles different elements of the electricity grid. They were partially successful, and then they stopped that, and some things were rebuilt with the help of our partners in the European Union and others. This year, after the 6-month pause in having American aid, when our army has literally run off of anti-missile defense, Russian missiles have become so much more effective that in March, April of this year, they have destroyed 70% of electrical energy generating capacity, which actually professes us a very cold and uncomfortable winter. And in this time, they also managed to raise wipe from the face of the earth few additional cities, like Avdiivka, I don't know if you ever heard of it, and currently Vovchansk, with a huge new military offensive in the Kharkiv region, with the horrible shelling of the Kharkiv city itself. How can we rebuild Kharkiv when it's constantly shelled, when it's just yesterday, a great publishing house has been totally set on fire, 65 people injured, 7 people dead. To stop this kind of aggression through defense measures, through deterrence, is the first task to get peace, the first task to be able to provide any reconstruction, because it's so utterly needed. The rate of destruction is really huge. But if we can't defend ourselves, we will just be annihilated. And that's not an option for us.
Loukas, Loukas, the last words go to you, and hopefully our colleagues will turn off the red light.
I shall be brief. First of all, I think I can say this on behalf of the authors of the report, that we are grateful for your generous comments. It is true that collective reports find it difficult to prioritize. If I were to summarize our 17 issues, they boil down to 3, as far as I can see it. The first is a call to arms for Europe to start thinking as a power and not as a peace project. That is a transformational thing. Number 2, the crucial role of technology. And I agree with you, Anne-Marie. that you cannot have security, you cannot even preserve your democracy and individual rights if you depend on the technology imported from others. And that should be clear by now to all Europeans. So if Europe continues to lag behind in technology, we are in deep trouble. And number three, Europe is a provider of public goods. Not only climate, health, and other things. So 17 issues summarized down to 3. Now, citizens, I think it's interesting, if you look at opinion polls throughout the last 10, 15 years, our citizens are ahead of our political class in terms of defense and foreign policy. There is a clear, big majority of European citizens that always take a position in favor of closer defense cooperation and a united foreign policy, which is not reflected in national policies within the European Union. And my last point, of course, the report attempts to provide a vision, okay? And a vision means that, it's a bit beyond realism. And I'm not sure how much progress Europe will make in the next few years. But what I'm sure about is that unless Europeans make significant progress in these areas, Europe will be marginalized in an increasingly threatening world. Europe will become irrelevant, and the cost of irrelevance is our incapacity to defend fundamental interests and values. And I would stop there.
Hear, hear.
So, Loukas, I'd like to close this panel by making one final and crucial point. The citizens are the audience for this argument. A vision of Europe is a vision that should and must be communicated as widely as possible, because citizens have the agency, and only citizens have the agency through their politicians and other elected officials to make change. So the point is not to tell citizens what to do in the sense of this is the role you play. It is to say this is the vision for the future of Europe. It is a vision that citizens must believe in and must encourage action toward if it is to succeed. Peace, prosperity, and all of the objectives of pursuing European values are what are at stake. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation, and thank you so much for joining us here at the State of the Union.
Thank you so much as well to our moderator, Eric Jones. What a fascinating panel. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it. It was absolutely gripping. A little bit frightening. I even had goosebumps when you spoke, but thank you so much. And where can we read that document? Where can we catch that report?
It's electronically available.
We'll make sure that everyone in the room gets a copy. But with that, it is time now to wrap up and conclude the 14th edition of the State of the Union. Thank you so much to everyone who's been working tirelessly for the last couple of months to make sure that we could have 30 panels over the last 2 days. So thank you so much to all those, and everyone, of course, behind the scenes here. Thank you to all the speakers as well, to all the moderators, and of course, thank you to you, the guests. You are, of course, as well the most important panelists here, the participants. You've been fantastic with all your questions. All that's left to do now is enjoy the rest of your evening here in Florence, and enjoy and have a great weekend tomorrow, and see you perhaps next year at the State of the Union. Take care. Bye-bye.